Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully, the mic is working this week. We happy that you have come to study Torah tonight. As we mentioned, we're doing this on Wednesday in observance of Thanksgiving, which is tomorrow. Somebody asked me tonight if I celebrate Thanksgiving, and the truth is, I don't necessarily do any traditions, but I celebrate the fact that in the United States we have a National Day of Thanks to God, which really is an amazing thing. So that, what I would say, is definitely the Jewish answer to that question. Okay. Tonight's learning is in merit of everybody in the land of Israel, and specifically those who are held hostage and held captive. That's the topic of tonight's class. So let's get right into it. The redeeming captives, redeeming people who are held captive, is something that has a long tradition in Jewish history, and we're going to go through a few of the more famous cases, and what the lessons we can learn, how we can help, even though we are not on the front lines, and we are not diplomats, and we're not politicians, and we're not involved in the day-to-day of redeeming these captives who are being held right now. But there is something that we can do. So let's talk about it and what the lessons are. So the first source that we have of redeeming captives is in the book of Genesis, is Abraham. Abraham is the first Jew, and he hears that his nephew, Lot, is being held captive. Okay, I had a little notification there. When it comes to, again, Abraham is the first Jew, and he hears that his nephew, Lot, is being held captive, and right away he wages war in the famous War of the Four Kings versus the Five Kings, and he goes to war and it frees him. That's in Genesis chapter 14, verses 14 through 16. So that is the first situation. Later in the book of Numbers, the Jewish people wage war against the Canaanite king of Arad because they had taken one maidservant hostage, and based on that, the Jewish people went to war and freed her. And conquered that whole area of Canaan, later being the land of Israel. Next, we have a story in the Talmud. A story in the Talmud. Obviously, we're not going through every situation of hostages in the history of Jewish people. We're just going through a few of them. There is a story in the Talmud of Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania, and he once found a Jewish hostage, and he realized this was a very special person, and he what happened was, he said, who gave Jacob for a spoil and Israel to the robbers? And the child answered him, the rest of the verse of Isaiah, did not God, he against whom we have sinned, and whose ways they would not walk, neither were they obedient to his law. So because, and again, this is in the city of Rome, so he realized this is a very special child, and he said that he is not going to leave. He's not going to leave wherever he was. I believe outside the. I think he was outside, either outside the prison, or he was outside of the. He was outside of the study hall. And because he was Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania, was obviously a very great Jewish leader, people took it seriously, and they raised the money to ransom him, and he was able to be freed. And later, this child ended up growing up to be Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, who is a very famous rabbi in the Talmud. So we see here this is a Jewish tradition going back to Abraham, that we will of freeing captives, freeing people who are held hostage, whether through money or through war. Let's get into the actual mitzvah. It's brought in the Talmud that redeeming captives is a great mitzvah. How do we know it's a great mitzvah? So there's a verse in Jeremiah. The verse in Jeremiah says, Jeremiah chapter 15, verses 1 and 2, it says, if it shall be, if they say to you, where shall we go? You shall say to them, so said God. Such as are for death to death, such as are for the sword to the sword, and such are for famine to famine, and such as for captivity to captivity. So the Talmud points out the fact that that captivity is the last thing in the verse. Every single thing it gets, it's a more severe. So the fact that captivity is the last thing, it is considered the worst thing possible to happen to a person. Why? Death mutilates the body. Right, so it's the sword mutilates the body, so it's worse than death. Death by sword is worse than regular death. Famine is worse because there's a lot of pain in famine, and being held captive is the worst because all those things are there. There's famine, there's the sword, there's death. All those things are involved in being held captive. Therefore, according to Jewish law, according to the verse, I should say, and based on this Talmud, actually being held captive is worse than being put to death, God forbid. Now, when it comes to practical halacha, practical Jewish law, Maimonides says that the redemption of captive receives priority over any other type of charity. And I'll just read a few lines from Maimonides, and then we'll read from the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. So Maimonides, in his Laws of Gifts to the Poor, he says there's that redemption of captives receives priority over sustaining the poor. There is no greater mitzvah than redemption of the captives, for a captive is among those who are hungry, thirsty, and unclothed, and is in mortal danger. People that pay no attention to the redemption of captives violate the negative commandment. Do not harden your heart or close your hand. Do not stand by when the blood of your neighbor is in danger. And he shall not oppress him with exhausting work in your presence. So, and he lists more. So we see Maimonides Maimonides' opinion is, I should say, that redeeming captives is the number one priority of any type of charity, simply because those people are suffering in all the ways that a poor person or any other needy person is suffering. When it comes to the Code of Jewish Law, in Yoredeah 252:3 says, every moment delayed in redeeming captives is tantamount to bloodshed. So we see here clearly that redeeming captives is a number one priority, not just in historical, but in practical Jewish law. That all the codes, until the most modern codes, talk about redemption of captives being a gigantic mitzvah that could potentially save a life. So, like we said, we're not diplomats, we're not politicians, we're not soldiers. So we're sitting here in the diaspora. What can we do? So we're going to discuss a little bit a story of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe when he left Russia, and he considered all the people that he had left behind, that he didn't really have a choice. He had to flee for his life, essentially, after being held himself in jail for the crime of teaching Torah. He had to leave Russia, and he left behind many of his Hasidim, many of his colleagues and students, and he always talked about them. And then the Lubavitcher Rebbe as well, his successor, always discussed these people who were left behind in Russia. And they, after the wedding of his son-in-law, the previous Rebbe, at the wedding of his daughter and son-in-law, who ended up becoming the Rebbe, he said that we should say l'chaim for them, and he instructed to send a telegram to all the cities in Russia using a pseudonym of the word of like a relative, because using his real name would be dangerous. And he went on to discuss this idea in spiritual terms. So let's get into it. He discussed a passage in the Talmud in Pesachim, page 87 to 87b, and he says as follows. It says as follows: Amar Rabbi Oshia said, "What is the meaning of the verse? Tzidkas Pizrainai, B'Yisrael. What does it mean? The righteous acts of restoring open cities in Israel." So the word Pizrainai could also be if you switch the letters, Pizrainai could be Pizrainai. So he said as follows: Tzedakah asa Kadosh Baruch Hu, God did the Jewish people a favor. Shepizran Levena Umas, that he dispersed. Again, switching the letters, instead of Pizrainai, that he dispersed the people amongst the nations. And Rashi explains. Rashi's commentary on the Talmud says, why is it why he do the Jewish people a favor by dispersing them amongst the nations? Seemingly, it would be much better for the Jewish people all to be together. But he said, because if it would be impossible to annihilate all the Jewish people at once. So even if a Jewish people would be under siege or being persecuted in one area of the world, the Jewish people in the other area of the world would survive. But the previous Rabbi builds on that idea. And he says it's not just the fact that the Jewish people in one area of the world could survive, but actually the Jewish people in the other area of the world, by doing the Torah and doing the mitzvahs itself, helps the Jewish people who are being held captive or persecuted in another area of the world. So in other words, in his time, the previous Rabbi was saying that the fact that Jewish people in Russia are stuck and they're not able to observe Torah and mitzvahs properly because of their situation being held captive behind the Iron Curtain in Soviet Russia, that by us doing the mitzvahs, we can do mitzvahs for them. And that goes further, that because the Jewish people are all really one body, we're like different limbs of one body, the fact that one person somewhere is doing a mitzvah has an effect on the other person doing a mitzvah as well. And there is also a psychological component to this as well. The fact that the previous Rebbe was speaking about them eventually made its way back to Russia, and the fact, like we said, he sent a telegram on that occasion at the wedding of his daughter, but throughout the leadership of the previous Rebbe and later his successor, the Rebbe, the fact that he spoke about these people and they eventually made its way back to them, and they knew that they were on the minds of the Rebbe, and the other Hasidim, the other students of the Rebbe in outside of Russia, whether it was in Poland and later in the United States and Israel, that itself gave them tremendous courage. I'll say a short story. There was a Chassid who I happen to know myself. His name was Rabbi Binyamin Katz. I knew him when I was in yeshiva in New Haven, let's say like 15 years ago. He's since passed away. He told us some of his stories of being he had a photographic memory. I've seen him use it. It was the most amazing thing you could ever see. He would close his eyes and he would like read a book with his finger, with his eyes closed, and he would actually be reading the book. So he had this photographic memory. So because he had a photographic memory, the Rebbe sent him to Soviet Russia in the 1960s. At the time, the Soviet government said that they would allow family reunification or something like that to let certain people out of Russia. And they said if Israel were to give them names of people to, reunify families with citizens of Israel, they would allow those people to leave Russia. The problem was the trick was that, of course, Israel did not know any names of people in Russia. So basically what he did was he went to Russia and he would memorize these names, because writing them down was extremely dangerous, both for him and for whoever's names they were. So what he would do is, he told us this, what he ended up doing was he spent a couple months in different areas of Russia, Moscow and I guess Leningrad or wherever it was. I remember Moscow specifically. He told us that he was the chazan, and eventually people realized why he was there. I don't know if he ever told anybody, or in Russia it was a very different way of how people communicated, very non-verbal communication. And he became the chazan. Every day he was the chazan. In Russia it was legal to have religion, just not only old people and stuff like that. So he was a tourist, so he was able to do that. He went to synagogue every day, and he would he would be the chazan. People would leave their names in little tiny pieces of paper on the lectern where he was leading the prayers. After the prayers, he would go to the bathroom, memorize all the names, flush them down the toilet. And later, eventually, he actually met those people who left Russia. So they never but they were so traumatized from their living under Soviet rule, they wouldn't even acknowledge him. This is in New York City. They wouldn't even acknowledge him, or in Israel, wherever he would see them, they wouldn't even acknowledge him then. That was kind of how it was. So getting back to our story, just to give you a little background on who Rabbi Katz was, he was once accosted by two Hasidim because they didn't know who he was. I remember him telling us this, and he thought they were going to kill him. He thought, yeah, and basically they asked him when they realized who he was, that he wasn't anybody to, that he was actually a messenger from the Rebbe. They asked him, does the Rebbe think about us? And he said, the Rebbe's always thinking about you. The Rebbe says l'chaim at a farbrengen, or he'll speak about the Jews in Russia. And he said it gave them tremendous strength. And later, when these Hasidim left Russia, these young Hasidim were Yosef Machkin and Michael Vyshetsky specifically. These Hasidim later said how that emotionally and psychologically gave them a lot of hope. The fact that they had found out that the Rebbe is always speaking and thinking about them. And the fact that other people outside of their situation was thinking about them, that itself gave them the hope and strength, and eventually they themselves were able to leave the Soviet Union. So just going back to kind of summarize, is number one is that redeeming captives is a tremendous mitzvah. Number two, even though we ourselves are not necessarily involved in that, by studying Torah, we can study Torah on their behalf and also in their merit. And three, on an emotional and psychological level, it's important that they know, and they will know. They will know whether it's spiritually or just they know that people are thinking about them, or they find out that people are thinking about them. It gives them tremendous hope. So those are the three basic things that we can do for in the merit of people who are being held hostage right now. Now, the question is, the Torah is something that is eternal and is relevant to all times and all places and all situations. So what does redeeming captives really have to do with, right now we're in a situation in the world where there are captives being held, but even ourselves, obviously the Torah must be relevant to us, not just the people being held hostage. So, or in a time when there are hostages. So there's also the idea of spiritual captivity. And when it comes to spiritual captivity, just like a person is being held hostage, cannot leave and cannot get out of their situation, there's a spiritual captivity is somebody who is their evil inclination essentially is holding them hostage. So in other words, a person wants to be involved in Torah and he wants to be involved in he wants to be involved in doing mitzvahs, but he feels like he can't. He's stuck. He's being held hostage. So how does a person do this? So number one, there's an idea in Torah that somebody who is in prison cannot redeem themselves, right? That a person needs help of others. You need someone else to redeem you. That's the definition of being held hostage, is that you cannot redeem yourself. So, but even though that a person maybe feel that he's captive by his evil inclination, he's being held captive by the Yetzer Hara, and he can't break through and break out of the rut that he's in, someone else can help them. And even if that person themselves is struggling with something, they have their own struggles, that person is not necessarily struggling with the same thing that someone else is. And the fact that they're struggling with something different means that they're able to now help that other person in the thing that they're struggling in. So in other words, you don't need somebody who is totally perfect to save people, who are to be a mentor and to be a friend and a guide and give guidance to somebody who is struggling. If you yourself are struggling, but you're not struggling in something else, you have the ability to help that person. So, in fact, we see this idea in that what we mentioned earlier, of that God spread the Jewish people all throughout the nations of the world, so that even if Jewish people were being persecuted in one area, they wouldn't be persecuted by others in another area. And we see this idea as well in our personal, captivity that we're discussing, that if a person is struggling in one area, God made it that not everybody struggles in the same way in the same thing. So if one person is struggling with one mitzvah, somebody else could be actually excelling in the thing that someone else is struggling in. And this idea is brought, that there's an idea that we might have discussed in our class at other times, that there were people in the Talmud that would say that they had the mitzvah they excelled in. And that idea is that a person that excels in this one area can therefore help somebody who's struggling in that area and lift them up and out of quote unquote captivity. And the same thing applies in an intergenerational way, that people who are it says that people who are, and also intercommunally, right? That people who are struggling with one area of mitzvahs because of where they live, for example, people outside of the land of Israel cannot perform some mitzvahs that are specific to the land of Israel. So therefore, when people are cannot do certain mitzvahs because they're in the diaspora, the fact that people in Israel are doing those mitzvahs are able to help and uplift spiritually the people who are not able to do those mitzvahs. And the same thing applies to the fact that there are many mitzvahs that don't apply outside of the temple or outside of the temple period. And in this kind of way that all the generations are connected, that we said every Jew is connected, but not just Jews who are alive, even Jews from previous generations. The fact that our ancestors performed these mitzvahs in the temple services, and mitzvahs that are connected to the land of Israel, and mitzvahs that are connected to the time of the temple being around. Those people also uplift us as well. So just to kind of to wrap it up, I guess we'll say that as far as what we can do is that we are thinking about these people who are being held hostage, who are being held captive, should know that we are thinking about them, whether we're in the land of Israel or outside us, sitting here in the diaspora. We are thinking about them. We are thinking about them spiritually. We are thinking about them materially. We are thinking about their plight, and they should know that we are doing everything that we can do, and we will continue to do everything that we can do until every single one gets home, and every single person in the land of Israel should feel safe and secure. And until then, we will continue doing mitzvahs until the coming of Mashiach. Wishing everybody a happy Thanksgiving and a good Shabbos, and God willing, we will see you next week. Back to the regular schedule on Thursday.